and the Prime Minister felt that his relationship with the new American president would be key to implementing the Blair Doctrine. But the new man was advised by neo-conservatives whose aim was to build up America's military strength and global leadership. On his first visit to see President Bush...
And it's one of the genius of Tony Blair. And he found George W.'s signal very fast and locked on, and found his wavelength. Meantime, George W., he's a politician, and he found George W.'s signal very fast and locked on, and found his wavelength. Meantime, George W., he's a politician.
A question for both of you. There's been a lot said about how different you are as people. Have you already in your talks found some personal interests that you have in common, maybe in religion or sport or music?
Well, we both use Colgate toothpaste. They're going to wonder how you know that, George. Yeah, the really alarming thing about that was that it happened to be true, because I went back and checked the toothpaste afterwards, and yes, it was, but I don't know.
In the first months, there was little to suggest that the Blair-Bush relationship had a genuine ring of confidence to it. But then came the events of savage September.
When something of such terrible force and impact hits your country, and he'd only been president for a very short space of time, it is a huge responsibility that then falls upon him.
This is a terrible moment, but this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
It was important that he knew that I understood a little bit of what he was going through. And one of the things that I was most determined about right from the outset after September the 11th was that America shouldn't feel that when its moment of crisis came and it was subject to this brutal and vindictive attack, that the world stood apart from them and said, well, that's your problem, you deal with it.
One of the first phone calls I got after that terrible day was from the Prime Minister. He was reassuring to me.
We stand side by side with you now, without hesitation.
Blair then flew round the world to try to build up support for Bush's planned war on terror. Blair was the president's international travelling salesman because of his profound belief in the special relationship. One of the things that is said, a former American Secretary of State said that in that moment of crisis, one of the elements in the special relationship, as far as America is concerned, is that Britain is prepared to send troops to commit themselves to, as he put it in a graphic phrase, to pay the blood price. I mean, do you recognise that?
Yes, I mean, what's important too is at that moment of crisis, they don't need to know simply that you're giving general expressions of support and sympathy. I mean, that's easy, frankly. They need to know you're prepared to commit, you're prepared to be there, and when the shooting starts, you're prepared to be there.
Blair sent troops to Afghanistan to help the Americans oust the Taliban and to aid in the search for Osama bin Laden.
We're fighting them. And one by one, we're bringing them to justice.
The Prime Minister's resolute support for the American president in his war on terror turned Blair himself into a target for terrorists. Saddam Hussein, the one-time ally of the West, had now become the #1 target for Bush and Blair in the war on terror. The two leaders said that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and the threat must be dealt with before it became lethal reality. A poodle, Blair's own moral certainties made him, if anything, the president's gun dog.
The one thing we have learnt, surely, after September the 11th, is not to wait till the threat materialises before acting upon it. Now, we're not at the stage of decision on Iraq, and there are all sorts of different ways that we might decide to deal with the actual threat that he poses. You know, I am very reluctant ever to get into military action, but there are some times in which it's inevitable. And so when I say that this is an issue that have to be dealt with, and I said that, as I say, 3 days after September the 11th, I mean it, not because America thinks it's important, I think it's important, I think Britain thinks it's important, or Britain should think it's important, because it's a real issue.
He genuinely believed, as we all did, Saddam Hussein was a nasty person and better got rid of. And I think he was also a bit kind of seduced by the special relationship, which is a very seductive one, and I think that he found it difficult to distinguish between British interest and American interest.
Blair looked for evidence to convince the British public of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. As Prime Minister, he would receive top-secret intelligence briefings from our international spy network. Tony Blair now made the unprecedented decision to publish a dossier drawn up by Britain's intelligence chiefs, headed by MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service.
I'm aware, of course, that people are going to have to take elements of this on the good faith of our intelligence services. But this is what they are telling me, the British Prime Minister, and my senior colleagues. The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative.
That dossier was to prove hugely controversial in the months to come. The following year, Blair was forced to bring in Lord... In Europe, where Blair had said he wanted to be the crucial bridge with America, his pro-Bush stance over Iraq was not going down well among many of its top leaders. At an EU meeting in October 2002, France and Germany led the doubters. President Chirac challenged Blair directly in the meeting about the case for war against Saddam.
I remember Chirac saying,
Je considère que la guerre, c'est toujours la plus mauvaise des solutions. J'ajoute que je trouve que dans cette région, on n'a pas besoin d'une guerre supplémentaire.
In early 2003, Number 10 produced another anti-Saddam dossier. Masterminded by Alistair Campbell, the dossier was quickly discredited as public skepticism grew about the government's case for action against Iraq. The decision to deploy armoured cars that looked like tanks at Heathrow Airport aroused great public suspicion. Many people wondered whether there was a real threat of terrorist attack, or whether it was the Number 10 spin machine that was behind the decision.
We put in what we call the Ring of Steel around Heathrow, armoured cars.
So why do you think there was this level of cynicism by the public? Blair himself decided to confront opponents of the war in the TV studios in what Alistair Campbell called the masochism strategy.
Just one more point, Mr. Blair. You are a man that has come across in our country, and I know I've spoken to lots of women. They said, this man, he comes across as a genuine man, a family-orientated man. A man is not only a Christian, but a church-going Christian. Now, to me, Mr. Blair, what you're going to do, and I'm sure you're going to do it, you and Mr. Bush, you're going to go and now bomb Iraq, and it's not dissimilar to what Bin Laden or the Al-Qaeda network done to America.
Whenever you take military action, it is true that innocent people die as well as guilty ones, but sometimes you have to take that action if it's the only way of dealing with the threat that is there.
Tony Blair had always promised there would be United Nations backing for military action against Saddam. and in the spring of 2003, there was feverish activity and scrabbling for votes by the British in the Security Council. They wanted a second UN resolution that would ratchet up the pressure against Saddam.
Why we tried a second resolution? I think that the Prime Minister was extremely disappointed not to have specific UN backing. And I think that I didn't serve him particularly well in that we didn't get the second resolution.
With many countries opposed to war against Iraq, a second resolution proved impossible. And inside Number 10, the blame game began.
I recall the moment, because I happened to be in the corridor in Number 10, had said that as of that moment, France would veto a resolution authorizing war.
Quelles que soient les circonstances, la France votera non parce qu'elle considère, ce soir, qu'il n'y a pas lieu de faire une guerre pour atteindre l'objectif que nous nous sommes fixés, c'est-à-dire le désarmement de l'Irak.
Blair knew his party was deeply split on Iraq, and if he couldn't persuade a majority of his own MPs to back the war, it would mean the end for him.
You would get a sense from talking to those in Number 10 around the Prime Minister how, because he was on a knife edge.
Despite playing the anti-French card, Blair could still not be sure that he would get the support of most of his own MPs in the big vote on going to war with Iraq. He knew, though, he could count on the support of the Tories.
It is the duty of the government to act in the national interest. This is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing. I beg to move the motion.
Doing the right thing again won the day. And as Blair prepared to tell the nation it was going to war, he sought his press secretary Alistair Campbell's advice on how he should address the British people.
Well, Tony Blair said to Alistair, what do you?
The land war itself was short and sharp. The American high-speed race across the desert took them straight to Baghdad, where they met little resistance. Tony Blair arrived in Basra with the war seemingly won within a month. Saddam had been overthrown, our troops had performed well and had taken few casualties from enemy action. For Blair, who developed the doctrine of using military might against dictators across the world, it looked like a famous victory.
When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it. It was your courage and your professionalism that did it.
There was a vacuum from the beginning into which the looters, the saboteurs, the criminals, the insurgents moved very quickly.
The Pentagon had told the British that American troops would be greeted as liberators and garlanded with flowers. But post-war Iraq was not following the neocon script. Baghdad 2003 was not exactly Paris 1944, although they were still starry-eyed in Washington.